Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Tom Cooper, and I am director of the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. Thanks so much for joining us on our latest webinar and today's conversation on living wage, why it matters, what's changing in 2025, and how employers, researchers, community advocates, and sector partners are all working together to advance the movement. We've got a really outstanding panel today. I'll introduce them very quickly, but we'll talk to them a little bit more later in the webinar. Deirdre Pike is joining us, a longtime advocate and community leader. Deirdre is one of the co-founders of Living Wage Hamilton and is currently with the Anglican Diocese of Niagara, which also includes congregations in the Hamilton area. Also, longtime advocate for living wages, Ted Hildebrandt from the Social Planning and Research Council, and Ted has worked vigorously on living wages both here in Hamilton and in Halton region over the last decade or so. We have Justine Agada from Workforce Planning Hamilton. Thrilled to welcome Justine with us today. And last but not least, Ann Coleman from the Ontario Living Wage Network. And Ann's going to be taking us a little bit later through some of those questions we may have about employer certification and what it takes to become a living wage employer. Before we begin, though, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. And we acknowledge that we are gathered today physically or virtually on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. This agreement is a reminder that we all share responsibility for the land and, of course, for one another as well. And as we discuss fair wages and economic justice and building communities where everybody can thrive, we want to center this work in reconciliation and equity, ensuring that work lifts people out of poverty, not deeper into it, and is part of ensuring these responsibilities. Before we get into our discussion, though, something a little bit different we're going to show for you today. We're going to do a little time machine travel back to 2013, where CBC's The National came to Hamilton to learn a little bit more about living wage. So let's watch that clip from more than a decade ago. Craig?
Corinna Stroop can stare at the numbers, she can shuffle the bills, but the math doesn't change. Highlighting the unpaid balances only highlights her dilemma. Who will she pay first? Whoever will disconnect her next.
Because I have another notice from my internet that's a disconnection notice, so I'm going to have to see if I can work something out with them.
Subsisting on minimum wage means choosing between paying for rent or a root canal. It means wearing blankets to breakfast when the heat gets shut off.
It's hard not to get depressed when you see the reality. I certainly have my days, that's for sure, where you're just like, wow, is it ever going to end?
They hope to end it soon in Hamilton and other Canadian cities by replacing the minimum wage with something called the living wage. That's the minimum some economists have determined that families and individuals actually need to cover their costs. So, for example, here in Hamilton, that would mean a difference of close to $5 an hour more than Ontario's minimum wage of $10.25.
So we're standing outside the first Tim Hortons ever built in Canada, here in Hamilton in 1964. And Tim Hortons is just one example of a business of many businesses who don't pay their employees a living wage.
For the last 3 years, Deirdre Pike has been waging a war on the minimum wage in Hamilton.
People thought people are being paid a minimum wage. Isn't that enough? Now we are asking people to do the math. And in Ontario, for example, if you multiply 10.25 times 40 hours, if you could even ever find a 40-hour-a-week job, and do that math, you are still not above the poverty line.
She convinced the city of Hamilton to study the feasibility of paying all of its employees at least a living wage. It would be the first big city in Canada to do so, following the lead of New Westminster and Esquimalt in British Columbia. It's a different story south of the border, where living wage legislation has been passed in almost 150 American cities, covering millions of municipal and state workers. Canadian activists are hoping to turn the vague discontent of the Occupy protesters into support for a practical solution.
This is Kay from Acorn. We are having an action.
Acorn Canada is trying to rally support for living wage legislation across the country.
People are already emotional about it because if you go to the food bank and you see the working families who have to line up in the food bank, it's not very easy.
Ward Cowan was a welder, but in Hamilton there hasn't been much need for welders in years.
It just spiraled out of control to the point where I lost the car, I lost my housing, and I lost my job. Hi, Francis. Oh.
Cowan works a variety of minimum wage jobs, but he can't survive without the food bank. About 1 in 10 here have jobs. They're among Hamilton's 30,000 working poor. The difference between minimum wage and a living wage, that $5 an hour, Cowan says, is a lot bigger than it sounds.
I think it would be amazing, I don't think I'd have to go to a food bank.
And advocates say the benefits of the living wage extend far beyond the folks receiving the paychecks.
He's trying to highlight it.
So now the drive is on to convince the community.
We're now driving through an area of Hamilton that is home to many low-income members of our community.
Tom Cooper is taking me on a tour of Hamilton's downtrodden east side. His pitch? Paying poor workers more costs less in the long run.
People living in poverty in some of these areas are dying on average about 21 years earlier than people living in more affluent areas of our city. And so we see living wage as helping to promote health as well from a community perspective. And it really is a long-term investment in our community's future.
But living wage legislation is just the beginning. The bylaw only covers municipal employees. Those who back the living wage will have to convince private sector employers to pay more voluntarily. So why would a company choose to pump up its payroll?
All right, Joy, nice and easy.
Matthew Green sees it as an investment in his own company.
This will get your heart rate up real fast.
When he opens his gym next month, Green promises to pay his staff a living wage. Civic duty, corporate responsibility, sure, but happier employees means more loyalty and less turnover.
At the end of the day, if I have to go out and find a new person to replace them, then the cost for that is probably more than what the difference would be between the minimum wage and the living wage. So it just makes sense.
Makes sense to Corinna Stroop, too.
The difference a couple dollars would make would be I'd be able to pay my phone bill without worrying about getting cut off.
A living wage would mean no more juggling bills, no more disconnections. It would mean she wouldn't pull down the same minimum wage paycheck as her teenage son.
Wow, that was quite a trip down memory lane. And one of the stars of that clip was Deirdre Pike way back then, wearing rainbow gloves. It's great to see you, Deirdre. What do you remember most about those early days of the living wage campaign?
It was the reference in there to doing the math. The fact that bringing people together to learn about the difference between a minimum wage and a living wage. And in our case, we were often using the social assistance income sometimes to compare to show people, how would you budget? Do the math. And we gave out buttons. It was just a really, I remember meeting at the Sky Dragon Center. It was very grassroots. Jan Lucas and some of the people from some of those organizations who were former teachers were just astounded when they were asked, well, what would you leave out if you only made this much? Cable? Remember cable? Um, would you allow for internet? And people had to put down their kind of really judgy ways in terms of what would we allow people in low income situations to spend their money on, kind of thing. And once they saw, it became just so apparent that you can't afford to live on minimum wage as it was at the time, and certainly social assistance. So that doing the math was brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. Why do you think the movement started here in Hamilton the way it did? We collaborated a lot with Waterloo Region, a few other communities, but Living Wage really seemed to have a lot of momentum here in Hamilton. And I can recall you working with teaching assistants at McMaster, talking about Living Wage. What brought it up to the fore for you, Deirdre?
Well, this is a city, of and for workers, right? It's well known with that, with our strong commitment there. And so first of all, workers, but then what did workers mean? Well, students were interested in this too, because students are workers, and the living wage included students. And when people started to, again, reference to doing the math, put 2 and 2 together about the reality of frozen minimum wage rates, for, back into the 90s with Harris's government for sure. And then even off and on up until the time when we first launched the living wage here, the impact was very real for people. People could start to even think about their kids living in their basements. Remember, we had those meetings with Rob Howard at the editorial board at The Spectator, and all of a sudden, light bulbs were going on for parents saying, oh, if my kid made a living wage, he wouldn't be in my basement, this kind of thing. And so I think, again, it was so tangible to this community. People could see themselves reflected in it, in the stories about participation and what it meant to participate in your community.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Deirdre. And we'll come back to you in a few minutes because I do want to talk about your role at the Anglican Diocese and what encouraged the diocese to become a living wage employer.
Yeah, well, thanks for the trip down memory lane.
Okay, and it was great seeing you. I'm going to move over to Ted Hildebrandt from Social Planning and Research Council now. And the Hamilton living wage rate, the new one for 2025, was just released last Monday by the Ontario Living Wage Network. And what a living wage does is really reflect what workers need to earn at their jobs to not only be able to meet their needs, but also participate in the community. And the latest living wage rate, I think Ted has shown there's a widening gap between wages and certainly housing costs. Ted, you've been working on the data side of things for a lot of years. What are some of the cost drivers pushing up Hamilton's living wage this year?
Yeah, great question. And I think it comes probably as no surprise that, the biggest driver is housing, shelter costs, people paying rent. This is especially true for households that only have one income earner. Lots of pressure. We've seen, even though more recently we've seen some of the housing prices stabilize a bit, but they're not coming down at a rate that actually closes that gap significantly. And so households are they're having to stay in affordable rental accommodation that they currently have, even if it's not fully suitable or if there's issues with it. They can't move, because the moment that they move, they're going to be paying significantly more than what they are. We've seen a loss of thousands and thousands of affordable housing units in Hamilton over the last decade or so, and that's really put that pressure. So the shelter costs are really the big one. But we've got a couple of others that are driving food costs, as Deirdre alluded to. We've had food costs. They're statistically, they haven't gone up as much, but when you look at it collectively over the last number of years, the last decade, there's a lot going on there in terms of the pressures, and we're always catching up. As we have the data that we use for the calculation, we're always catching up to what's happening now. And then I think health insurance was another one that we saw this year was was a big increase. And that's not just in Hamilton, but right across the province where we're seeing, so for those that don't have a benefit package, if they're paying those health insurance costs, those have really risen. And then I think the other last one is childcare. We even with the promise of $10 a day childcare, we're not there yet. There's still issues with space, and those that can access the subsidies, I think that's still a challenge. And so we're seeing some of those challenges of families that aren't eligible for those childcare subsidies that are now having to again make those decisions of how do they pay the bills on when they're not making something like the living wage.
Yeah, absolutely, Ted. And it's an important reminder. And another important reminder that I neglected to mention off the top is that if our audience members have any questions for our panelists, for Ted or Deirdre, Justine, or Anne, there's a Q&A button right at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So just click on that. You can put in a question and we'll try to get to them before the end of this webinar. Ted, one more question. So there was a report that just came out a few weeks ago from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, working with the Ontario Living Wage Network. And it showed, you heard, that national clip say that there were 30,000 workers in Hamilton not earning a living wage back in 2013. That number for the census metropolitan area, so it includes Hamilton, but it also includes Grimsby and Burlington. But that number is now 60,000 workers who go to their jobs, do everything right, but are not earning enough to pull themselves or their families out of poverty. Can you tell us a little bit, Ted, about who those workers are, what sectors are most affected by not earning a living wage?
Yeah, so yeah, a really important study, and that was based on the 2024 living wage rate. So with our new rate, that number might even be greater. But yeah, we're over 60,000 workers in Hamilton that aren't earning a living wage currently. That's a real big impact, and many workers, they can't, their week's worth of work doesn't cover a week's worth of living. Right, like as I think Deirdre was mentioning earlier, and so in Hamilton, like you said, it's about 16.7%, almost 17% of workers are earning less than a living wage. Of those, about 20% are women. And so we see that again, it doesn't cut across the same. And for racialized workers, it's about almost 21%. Of racialized workers are earning less than a living wage. So we're seeing also those intersections and again, different population groups that are being more adversely affected. And of course, when you're talking about households that might only have one income earner, that just adds that pressure to make things meet. In terms of sectors, I think again, it cuts right across. I think many sectors have those entry level, low, minimum wage, maybe a little bit more, but not coming up to our living wage rates. And so it's not, any one particular sector that stands out, but it's, right across the board that we have workers in all walks of life that are being affected and not being able to meet their daily living needs.
Yeah. Okay, that's great, Ted. Thanks. And again, if anybody has questions for Ted about the numbers or any of our other panelists, feel free to drop that in the Q&A and we will try to get to them. I want to turn to Justine now. So another key part of understanding living wage is hearing from employers themselves. And Hamilton, has had a lot of fantastic champions in the employer sector who have voluntarily taken on living wage. We have Hamilton Chamber of Commerce. We have a number of nonprofit organizations, small businesses. But Justine, Workforce Planning Hamilton works every year with the City of Hamilton's Economic Development Department to talk to employers. And that's one of your main roles is really trying to understand the employer landscape. So you put out a survey annually, the Employer One Business Survey, which includes questions about living wage. So I want to dive into that a bit, Justine. Can you walk us through what questions the survey asks about living wage and why Workforce Planning Hamilton felt it was important to include them when engaging employers?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me, first of all. In response to your question, currently we're still working with last year's results from the Employer One survey. We did have questions about the living wage. We specifically asked employers if they were offering living wages to their employees. Happy to report that over half of employers who responded do offer a living wage of at least $21.30 at the time, at least, to their employees. And a part of our survey also invites employers to learn more about living wage or how to support their employees with living wage. It's just a simple form to input their information, and somebody within the city or connected organizations reaches out and provides resources and pathways for them to get on the path to supporting their employees with proper income.
Great, and that's fantastic that we're able to connect them and potentially get them certified as living wage employers down the road too. One thing I should mention is that the Ontario Living Wage Network has more than 800 workplaces right across the province that are certified living wage employers. Meaning that full-time, part-time workers are getting that living wage, and they're working towards contracted out staff as well. So Justine, based on what you're seeing and what you're hearing from employers, are they familiar with the actual concept of living wage? So has it sort of entered the popular vernacular now, and people understand what that means, do you think?
I would say it's very difficult for anybody in today's day and age to not be at least even just slightly familiar with the concept of living wage. I think it's something that's been very, very popularized with the rise of social media and like activism groups that have become more popular and more widely available. So I would find it hard to believe that most employers are not familiar with the concept. I think if most, if not all of them are. That said, there's a difference between those who, of course, are aware of it and those who are able to implement it in their businesses. And there's a wide array of issues or reasons why an employer might not be offering that wage. I'm not going to try to justify it. I'm just going to speak to the reality of it that, and especially in today's day and age, we're kind of in tighter economic times. So everybody is kind of tightening the belt. And I know that there are probably many employers who are, ready to kind of take advantage of that discourse and say, okay, well, this is the reason why this can't be offered. That said, I don't think that the discussion has to be a polarized one. I think it could be a collaborative one where, everybody enters into the conversation with an open mind and a collective desire to at least want to just make our collective experience in Hamilton livable and enjoyable. And I think that's probably the best place to start. But yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. And just unpack that a little bit more. Are you seeing any sort of patterns amongst individual sectors that you've engaged with, different sizes of businesses, large versus medium versus small, that are able to look at living wage and kind of embrace it? Is there, or does it just depend on the individual employer?
I think in some ways it depends on the individual employer. I think with smaller businesses, it's something that gets picked up a lot more in terms of consideration, especially those businesses that want to be maybe aligned with certain causes or movements. The bigger organizations, of course, I feel usually try to kind of maintain that kind of bottom line. That said, I think that right now, unfortunately, the ball is not really in the court of the employee because there's just so few jobs available and it's such a competitive market currently that nobody is really pushing, for that living wage. I think everybody is just kind of desperate to find a job, to find work, and to be able to meet the demands of the higher increasing cost of living. So in that sense, even for those employers who might be interested in conversation around living wage, I don't think that there's a big enough incentive right now, as most people are concerned with just getting a job at all and not really asking many questions beyond that, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, that's really helpful information to have. Thank you. Thanks, Justine. We'll come back probably with some more questions a little bit later in the webinar. But now I'd like to bring in Ann Coleman from the Ontario Living Wage Network to talk to us a little bit about how the movement has evolved over the years And really, what are some of the steps for employers interested in becoming certified living wage employers? So welcome, Anne. Great to see you.
Thanks, Tom.
So can you talk to us a little bit about the living wage movement and how it's evolved? Because you've been involved almost right from the beginning, from your engagement back in Waterloo region, and when there were only a few communities kind of talking and engaging about living wage, and now it's really blossomed. Can you take us through that journey a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. Well, from my understanding, the living wage sort of movement, I guess, in Ontario really started to catch or really began in around 2010, somewhere around there. There had been some work happening in BC, and there were a number of local community groups across the province of Ontario that really wanted to start doing local living wage calculations for their communities. And that certainly includes Hamilton, which is probably one of the first. And then, as you mentioned as well, Waterloo region was right there along for the ride as well. The methodology for calculating the living wage was created by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Ontario. And that was a methodology that was adopted by local communities across the province. There were a handful of us back in about 2014 that came together to actually form the Ontario Living Wage Network. And since 2014, things have really grown. So, at that time, the network was really about furthering the conversation about the living wage in the province. But the calculations were mostly done using the same methodology. There's maybe a few outliers. Certainly over the years that became very streamlined. The Ontario Living Wage Network became incorporated as a nonprofit organization in 2020. And we engaged in a research project to find the optimal number of living wage rates in the province. So I think back in maybe 22 or 23, there were actually 28 different local living wage calculations across Ontario, and we still had major areas, York Region, Oxford County, Brant County, that did not have living wage calculations. So we actually came up with a methodology where we have broken the province down into 10 different living wage regions, loosely based on economic regions provided by Statistics Canada. So we're now able to calculate living wage rates for the entire province based on areas where people both live and work.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful information, Anne. And I guess just for those who may not be aware, the living wage is calculated based on 3 different family types, right? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so originally the living wage was, the conversations began around child poverty coming out of Campaign 2000. Why are children living in poverty? It's because their parents just can't make ends meet. So the original reference family was a family of 4 with 2 working adults and 2 children. And there was some testing done around that time, just taking a look at single individuals and a single parent with 1 child. And the living wage rates, back in 2014, when I first started doing this work, were fairly similar for those different household types. Things have changed quite a bit. In 2016, the Canada Child Benefit came in as a national credit to support families with young children. In 2019, I believe, the care credit, provincial child care credit came in. And, the living wage rate for the family of 4 looked a lot different than it did for the individual and the single parent. So we now look at all 3 of those household types, collect data, annual expenses for each of them, and then we do a weighted average on how common those different household types are in our province to find the end resulting living wage rate.
That's great. Thanks for that background, Anne. So you hear from employers all the time. They're calling you up, asking questions about how do we become certified living wage employers. What's a motivating factor that you've heard from them in terms of their interest in signing up as living wage certified organizations?
I think one of the main things that I hear is that the living wage is something that represents the values of a business or organization. It's a lot of times people will say it's the right thing to do. We also know that young people coming out of post-secondary education are looking for jobs that reflect own values as well. So it's a great way to just show that, have that sort of living wage stamp for your business, and knowing that you're trying to do the best that you can for your employees, and not just the minimum with minimum wage. I think as well, though, there really is a business case for paying a living wage. I hear over and over again from employers that have joined our program, and particularly the employers that have really had to make a difference in their business and raise wages to meet the living wage, that when they begin paying a living wage, they see increased staff retention rates. They spend less money hiring and training new employees, and less time on that. If you think about it, if an employee is staying with a business, they have that opportunity to become an expert at what they're doing, and a real champion for the business. They are better able to serve their customers or clients, and really support the work that the business is trying to do in the community.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Anne. And so take me through the certification process. Let's say I'm an employer. I call you up at the Ontario Living Wage Network, and I'm interested in making the steps to ensure my business is paying a living wage to all the employees. How would you respond, and what sort of journey would you take an employer through to get certified?
Sure. Well, the process itself is very easy, and I will say it's particularly easy for employers that are already paying a living wage. If you have to do a little bit more work behind the scenes, it might take a little longer. Typically, the first step is to reach out through our website and indicate that you're interested in certification. I'll arrange to have a time to speak with you and learn more about your business and share the details of the living wage, the requirements of the living wage certification program, and answer any questions. After that phone conversation, there's an enrollment form that gets completed just to make sure that the business is meeting the requirements. There is an annual fee for employers to become certified with us, and it's fairly minimal. It depends on the number of employees that are in a business, and there's a nonprofit rate as well as a for-profit rate. They're a little bit different. There are times when I've had a conversation with an employer in the morning and then had them certified by the afternoon. When employers become certified with us, they're making a commitment to pay all of their direct and indirect employees at least the living wage. So direct employees is fairly straightforward. Anyone who's directly paying a wage or anyone they are directly paying a wage or salary to. Indirect refers to any third party or subcontracted workers that regularly work for a business. We do our best to try and ensure that those workers as well, a cleaning staff, for example, that maybe comes in and cleans the office every day, we'd like to try and ensure that those workers are also earning a living wage.
Yeah, no, that's critically important, particularly given the growth in gig work and short-term contracts. That's really helpful, Anne. And I'm going to probably come back with a few more questions a little bit later on. We do have a few in the chat, though. And I think this one is probably for Justine. Question, do you have the size of the 50% of businesses in Hamilton that are living wage employers? And we talked a little bit about the different organizations that might be paying a living wage or might be interested in paying a living wage. But do you have any response to that, Justine?
Our survey only captures respondents who participate in the survey, obviously, so I can't speak to the larger Hamilton landscape. All I can say is that roughly 52% of employers who took our survey offer living wages to their employee.
Okay, that's helpful. And I'm not sure if it looks like it may have been answered on the chat, but I'll just throw it out there for others who may not have seen a question to Ted. Do you have the breakdown of employees earning less than living wage by immigration status? So you touched on that a little bit. Any further information?
Yeah, so I think That's referring to that report that CCPA and Ontario Living Wage Network did together. Unfortunately, it doesn't have immigration status. It did it overall workers as well as racialized and by gender. Definitely a great question. It would probably take some more digging in the data to get at that. And I know that there will be again a different experience for those, particularly those that are more recent immigrants to our community that might not be making that living wage.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks, Ted. Another question from Frank. I'm not sure who may want to answer this, but maybe I'll throw it out to Deirdre, given that I know Deirdre is deeply passionate about both living wage and basic income. And so Frank's question is, how do we make the living wage and the livable basic income, example, Senate Bill S-206. So for those who may not be aware, that's a brand spanking new bill from Senator Kim Pate that will look at guaranteed livable income and hold hearings in the Senate on that. How do you make advocacy efforts more compatible and explainable to elected officials and the general public? Deirdre, can I put you on the spot for that one?
Sure. More compatible. So anyway, I think that the basic income one of the arguments is that people can't earn enough based on workers' wages, minimum wage for sure, and if we look at living wages, we'd still be able to say that basic income would provide that floor for when those workers are, in between looking for another position, all the ways that we've argued for the way workers would benefit from a basic income. So I think the compatibility is already there, the alignment of the two issues. How to make them more explainable? Well, I think the living wage is the most explainable, and I think the basic income can be as well. But it is more difficult because I'm just saying right now basic income, but you've already called it livable basic income, and there's the guaranteed livable basic. We have different names. So I think there is some work to be done in a little bit of what you're getting at there, making things explainable. So that's a little bit of info that I can provide on that question. I think we are going to make it more explainable because we're having Senator Kim Pate soon to a meeting that Tom and I are hosting shortly, and we'll have more information on that, and we'll keep working to make that better, those connections. I appreciate that question, Frank.
Yeah, and one thing you've always emphasized, Deirdre, is really, and maybe you could just go a little bit deeper on this as well, is living wage is definitely an evidence-based calculation. So it reflects what workers need to earn at their jobs based on the cost of housing, the cost of food, transportation, all the other things. But you often talk about living wage as being critical to community participation as well. And it's not just meeting, those bare necessities. It has to go beyond. And that's where I think basic income and living wage are compatible as well, right?
That's a great point. Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is, more than eating and being able to get to work and home to bed. There are other parts to people's lives, and we have to make all of that accessible. And I think that's definitely basic income goes a little further in getting there for sure, but those two things go together. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. I have a couple more questions for you, Deirdre, but want to check in on another question. I think I'll ask Anne this one. It's from Armand. And what is the ratio of for-profits versus nonprofit employers that are now certified in Ontario? And that's a great point, because Ontario Living Wage Network has both. But do you have a sense of if one is more prominent than the other?
Craig can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're at 60% for profit, 40 nonprofit. in around there. Typically, when employers first begin certifying in a community, we find that we get the nonprofit organizations signing on first, but then it certainly gets picked up by for-profit businesses. And I know that nonprofits are, depending on the nonprofit, a lot of time they're struggling with finding funding, and whether or not funders will, provide funding that allows them to pay a living wage rate. So sometimes there's that struggle, but they are typically the first adopters in the community to become certified.
Okay. Great. And here's a good question. It's a little bit pointed, but let's see who wants to take on this one. Have we all given up on the fight for replacing minimum wage with the living wage in legislation? That's an interesting question. Are they both compatible together? Or can we move one day to having, for lack of a better term, a legislated actual living wage? Who wants to take on that question?
I'll start by suggesting that, I think that the other thing about a living wage is it is a political number. It is evidence-based, and it is to begin a conversation about, or complete a conversation about the reality of what people need to make. And the fact is that even so, the government has kind of responded. Maybe they haven't said, oh, thank goodness for the Ontario living wage, which enlightened us to know that we should increase minimum wage. But they probably somewhere could credit this movement. And the fact is, if you think back, like the Wynne government, and it's kind of kept pace, I believe, the PSW number, for example, what PSWs have to make is still below a living wage in some communities. So if you're a PSW in Oakville, where I'm standing right now, you might make the average Ontario PSW makes $23.59. That's below the living wage. So we have to use this number really effectively to coerce, to really move the government into seeing where the minimum wage needs to be. So I don't think we've given up on that. I think it's really the purpose of this whole exercise is to continue to say to the Ontario government, in this case, you are not paying workers enough. You're not legislating workers' wages high enough. And so we will continue to tell the story. We'll continue to tell the truth about what it costs to participate in Ontario communities and what people need to make to feed themselves and if when they're their children. Yeah.
That's great. Let's I'm going to stick with Deirdre here, because Deirdre is also here, not only as one of the co-founders of Living Wage Hamilton way back in the day, as we saw on the national clip there, but these days Deirdre is also working with the Anglican Diocese of Niagara, who is a living wage employer. So, we've talked a little bit about for-profit organizations, nonprofit organizations. The Anglican Diocese is a faith organization, and what motivated the diocese to become a living wage employer, Deirdre?
At the time that that movement started, I was with the Social Planning and Research Council, and Ted wasn't. So many things have shifted in this picture in lots of great ways. And but at the time, the diocese had just started a new position called Justice and Outreach Program Consultant. And because of that commitment that they made, and the person they had in that role was a priest named Bill Mouse, who used to tweet a lot under Spirited Mouse about justice issues, we found a home for many of our anti-poverty groups to meet for free in the Anglican Cathedral downtown Hamilton. And that connection began a really important relationship around the justice work that the diocese was committed to, and its support for Hamilton and beyond Niagara. Really, it's the Diocese of Niagara, commitments to poverty reduction throughout. So living wage was one of the areas that the diocese stepped up and became attentive to from the get-go. Yeah.
So you work with individuals who are now earning a living wage, who before may not have been in particular roles. What's the effect been on individuals working with a living wage? Has it affected morale, the culture of the organization?
Yes, I mean, both those things are always highlighted. I think longevity is another thing that's important. The reality is people stay, and Anne already talked about the costs around training and recruitment and all of that. When you work in a faith community, and I work both for the bishop under the Diocese of Niagara, and where I'm standing right now, I earn a living wage. I work for an Anglican church in Oakville, and which is committed to that living wage. And the thing is that during the pandemic, faith communities went through a very big shift, and that continues to happen in lots of different ways, in terms of less people in the pews, obviously, in different ways, different things around ability to generate income to pay for staff. And so churches struggle. How many hours can they afford to have someone in a church office during the week? But there are things that need to be done. And so the fact is that when I look at across the diocese now at the various parish administrators and workers in all the different roles, I see those familiar faces. They've been there a long time. The diocese every year sends out another reminder. Here's the new living wage rate, and encourages parishes. They can't mandate them, but they encourage them. And that encouragement seems to be enough to get nearly, 100% compliance, if you want to say, to the living wage. I mean, it goes hand in hand with a commitment to faith and people, the people that we want to serve. So,
that's great. Thanks, Deirdre. And I want to move the conversation back to Anne for a few minutes, because this conversation that we're having may interest some employers around the community to become certified, to learn more about living wage. So Anne, what advice would you give to Hamilton employers that are considering certification now that the new 2025 rates are out?
Sure. I think number one, it's probably easier than you think. So, many employers, as Justine was saying, in Hamilton, certainly the ones that are completing the survey, are already paying a living wage. This is a great way for you to show the values of your business, your organization, and show that you are doing the right thing for your employees. For those of you that maybe are not quite there yet or not quite sure how to get there, I would love to have a conversation with you. There are opportunities for employers to phase in the implementation of living wage certification while still being recognized for the work that they're doing to get there, over a year or two. And I'm also always happy to do my best to connect you with another employer that is already certified for paying a living wage and that has been able to figure out how to make this work in their business model and be successful. Again, please reach out. I'm always happy to ask questions. There's no pressure to certify if you're not there yet, but I would be really happy to help you get started on that journey.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Anne. And Craig is currently posting some information in the chat about how you can become certified, and you can click on those links. I should have mentioned that Craig Pickthorn, of course, is always our backroom Zoom guy for these webinars, but Craig is also communications head of the Ontario Living Wage Network. And Craig, if I can put you on the spot for just one quick sec. I know we've had some really interesting coverage over the last couple of weeks because the new living wage rates have been out there. Are there any interesting stories or any interesting employers out there who signed on to the living wage? Maybe not this year, but in previous years. What's a cool story that you can tell us about some of those living wage employers? Because I know they come from a lot of different sectors and backgrounds.
Absolutely. Here's one thing that I go to often. It's not too long ago. It was the entire city of Waterloo, 100,000 people, certified as a living wage employer. And this is when people ask me, well, what really is the benefit of certification? The city of Waterloo certified, and on the spot, about 345 people got a raise of about $4 right then and there. And they will continue to earn a living wage because the city continues to be a certified employer. So I often talk about the power of large anchor public sector institutions that are employers in our name, their citizens, us, when they become a certified living wage employer and they're not holding anybody in working poverty. That's an example of a large impactful employer. And then the other thing I'll say about talking about the living wage is certainly during when we release our updates like we did last year, is that there's people out there that, you can't fault them necessarily, but they think that the minimum wage is a calculation. It's not really. It just looks at the increase to something called the Consumer Price Index. They're really surprised to learn that that's not a calculation. Ours is a calculation that looks at all these different things that a worker would have to cover. So those are the two things that stuck out to me this year, I think, Tom.
Yeah. Yeah, that's important information because, again, we can't emphasize this enough. Living wage is that evidence-based calculation that actually reflects what it costs to live in communities of different sizes. And that's, why a living wage in Toronto is going to be a little bit higher than it is in Toronto. It's, correct me if I'm wrong, Craig, 27 something in Toronto?
27.20, Tom, yeah.
27.20, and so that's Ontario's highest living wage rate. As you expect, Toronto has the highest cost of living in Ontario as well, and it's reflective of various costs throughout the province, from the north to the southwest, and the east, of course. There's one more question I'd like to get to before we wrap up, and I'm not maybe Anne, I could ask you about this one. Have you heard testimonies that paying a living wage bolstering applications for grants and funding for organizations? So I'm not sure if this is what the question's getting at, but we know there's lots of funding organizations out there. United Ways have been a tremendous supporter of the living wage movement, particularly right across the province. But there's also foundations and private funding organizations. Have they begun having conversations about when they're receiving applications for grants that they're building in a living wage for the people who may be working on those projects?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tom. I think, as you mentioned, we certainly have a lot of support from many different United Ways across the province, and many of them are certified living wage employers themselves. And that is something that they are, looking to be able to provide when doing grants, is to be able to provide a living wage. I'm not sure that it's completely there's a lot of different granting organizations out there, and I know that not all of them are looking at that. But there are certainly some of them that if you say that you're paying a living wage or paying above minimum wage, that is something that is of benefit for the nonprofit organization or the project or charity that is trying to apply for the grant. So I wouldn't say that it's something that's across the board, unfortunately, yet, but there are many organizations that are recognizing that this is something that's really important, and specifically organizations like United Ways that are trying to do their best to alleviate poverty within their communities.
Yeah, that's great. And just got a little note from Alicia here, our friend at United Way Halton and Hamilton, that they are indeed doing that, and certainly United Ways right across the province have been incredibly supportive of the Living Wage Network, including here in Hamilton Halton.
And Tom, can I just tag that answer with something that people may not know? If you want to be a B Corp certified business, which is a broad certification of many different best practices, you really have to be a certified living wage employer. It's a point-based system. Yeah. So that's kind of a cousin to that question. There's another thing, too, in the city of Toronto. You can apply for a tax benefit if you own land and you're in a certain industry called IMIT. It's a granting program. You have to become a certified living wage employer in order to apply for that tax break with the City of Toronto. So there's instances of different kinds of organizations incentivizing living wage certification. Just two of them for you.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Craig. There's a little bit of an inside baseball question here on the calculations, and it's from Frank. Are there plans to divide Northern Ontario into urban separate from rural areas? Because I think Frank's alluding that there may be, different costs to living in rural areas as opposed to urban centers in Northern Ontario, like Sault Ste. Marie or Thunder Bay or Sudbury. Anne or Craig?
Yeah. Again, another great question. I'm not super convinced that we have it right in the north yet, Frank. So thank you for pointing that out. And certainly there is a difference in living in rural areas versus urban areas right across Ontario. We find that in many different areas of our living wage calculations. And transportation being the main piece of it in rural areas, that is much higher than it is in an urban area like Hamilton, where there is a transit system that is able to be used. So right now, I don't expect that we're going to make changes to the North Living Wage region immediately. When I do the calculation or the data collection, I do assume a higher cost of transportation or a higher number of kilometers driven for people that are living in the north than I do in Southern Ontario. There's a few things like that. I'm not sure that we have the living wage rate that we have it now is certainly not going to cover costs for food in really remote communities of the north that where food costs are just so much higher than they are here in Southern Ontario. So there is still some work to do for that living wage region.
Great, thanks, Anne. We're just about up at the hour, and this has been a absolutely fantastic conversation. So thank you, everybody. But before we leave, I want to turn it over to Deirdre for one quick story. And then we'll wrap up. So Deirdre.
Yeah. Well, you asked earlier about some interesting employers kind of thing. And, I want to just, first of all, please get certified. I really know that that's an important emphasis. The documents are there and so on, and really spread the word because, it just really sets, it models a good example for other employers. And so one of those employers at the time, you might remember I had a column in the Hamilton Spectator, and I lauded Muskoka Brewery. Speaking of northern, I know it's not Northern Ontario, but in an area where workers are coming from a rural area to that brewery, they became a living wage employer at the time. And I applauded that and challenged them to also come up with a non-alcohol beer, because 10 years ago when we made that video, after that video, I was looking at myself in the video thinking, how can I get smaller? I'm going to get a non-alcohol beer, and they have one now. So there's for Muskoka Brewery, living wage, non-alcohol beer. And finally, I also wrote about how much do we care about our children in this province. Bus drivers, school bus drivers were not making a living wage. I still bet that they don't in many places, and other caring, responsible roles in this province. How much I hear parents and people talking all the time about how much they love their children, and yet we refuse to get up there to pay a living wage to really care for them in so many different places. So I think that the living wage has been really a wonderful conversation and has moved more than a yardstick in a decade. And I'm really pleased about that. Let us not stop. Let employers, that you say, well, of course I pay over minimum wage. Not of course. People don't know, and you need to set that example. So please to carry this conversation forward for another decade and get certified if you're not already. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Deirdre. And one thing we should mention just as we close out, that there are decals as well for employers who sign on to living wage. So Craig can certainly make those available. There it is right there. Craig can certainly make that available to highlight your championing of a living wage. So Justine, Ted, Deirdre, and Craig, thank you all so much for participating today. It was a great discussion, and we have lots of resources available. Please visit the Ontario Living Wage Network website to learn more, and appreciate your time today. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Tom. Great job.
Thank you.
Did we stop the recording, Craig?
Not yet.